Hey guys, welcome to my channel, Know Better, Do Better with Jess. We are up to day 5 of my daily video Christmas countdown, and today's going to be another story day. I'm going to read you the book, The Life and Adventures of Santa Claus by Frank Baum. He wrote this 2 years after he finished The Wizard of Oz. It's a little bit longer, so it might be 2 different days worth of videos. Hope you enjoy. Chapter 1, Burzy. Have you heard of the great forest of Burzy? Nurse used to sing of it when I was a child. She sang of the big tree trunks standing close together with their roots intertwining below the earth and their branches intertwining above it, of the rough coating of bark and weird gnarled limbs, of the bushy foliage that roofed the entire forest, save where the sunbeams found a path through which to touch the ground in little spots, and to cast weird and curious shadows over the mosses, the lichens, and the drifts of dried leaves. The forest of Burzy is mighty and grand and awesome to those who steal beneath its shade. Coming from the sunlit meadows into its mazes, it seems at first gloomy, then pleasant, and afterwards filled with never-ending delights. For hundreds of years it's flourished in all of its magnificence, the silence of its enclosure unbroken save by the chirp of busy chipmunks, the growl of wild beasts, and the songs of birds. Yet Burzy has its inhabitants. For all this, nature peopled in it in the beginning with fairies, nooks, riles, and nymphs. As long as the forest stands, it will be a home, a refuge and a playground to those sweet immortals who revel undisturbed in its depths. Civilization has never yet reached Burzy. Will it ever? I wonder. Chapter 2. Once, so long ago, our great-grandkids could scarcely have heard of it mentioned, there lived within the great forest of Burzy a wood nymph named Nooks. She was closely related to the mighty Queen Zurline, and her home was beneath the shade of a widespread oak. Once every year, on budding day, when the trees put forth their new buds, Nooks held the golden chalice of Ak to the lips of the queen, who drank therefore to the prosperity of the forest. So you see, she was a nymph of some importance, and moreover it is said that she was highly regarded because of her beauty and grace. When she was created, she could not have told. Queen Zurline could not have told. The great Ak himself could not have told. It was long ago, when the world was new and nymphs were needed to guard the forest and to minister to the wants of the young trees. Then on some day not remembered, Nooks sprang into being. Radiant, lovely, straight and slim as the sapling she was created to guard. Her hair was the color that lines a chestnut burr. Her eyes were blue in the sunlight and purple in the shade. Her cheeks bloomed with the faint pink that edges the clouds at sunset. Her lips were full red, pouting and sweet. For costume she adopted oak leaf green. All of the wood nymphs dressed in that color, and no other so desirable. Her dainty feet were sandal-clad, while her head remained bare of covering other than her silken tresses. Nooks' duties were few and simple. She kept hurtful weeds away from growing beneath her trees and saplings, the earth food required by her charges. She frightened away the gaggles who took evil delight in flying against the tree trunks and wounding them so that they dropped and died from the poisonous contact. In dry seasons she carried water from the brooks and pools and moistened the roots of her thirsty dependents. That was in the beginning. The weeds had now learned to avoid the forest where wood nymphs dwelt. The loathsome gaggles no longer dared come nigh. The trees had become old and sturdy and could bear the droughts better than when fresh sprouted. So Nooks' duties were lessened, and time grew laggard, while succeeding years became more tiresome and uneventful than the nymph's joyous spirit loved. Truly, the forest dwellers did not lack amusement. Each full moon they danced in the royal circle of the queen. There were also the Feast of Nuts, the Jubilee of the Autumn Tidings, the solemn ceremony of leaf shedding, and the revelry of budding day. But these periods of enjoyment were far apart, and left many weary hours between. That a wood nymph should grow discontented was not thought of by Nooks' sisters. It came upon her only after many years of brooding. But when once she had settled in her mind that life was irksome, she had no patience with her condition, and longed to do something of real interest. and to pass her days in ways hitherto undreamed of by forest nymphs. The law of the forest alone restrained her from going forth in search of adventure. While this mood lay heavy upon pretty Necile, it chanced that the great auk visited the forest of Burzee, and allowed the wood nymphs, as their wont, to lie at his feet and listen to the words of wisdom that fell from his lips. Auk was the master woodsman of the world. He sees everything and knows more than the sons of men. That night he held the queen's hand, for he loved the nymph as a father loves his children, and Necile lay at his feet with many of her sisters and earnestly hearkened as he spoke. "We live so happily, my fair ones, in our forest glade," said Auk, stroking his grizzled beard thoughtfully, "that we know nothing of the sorrow and misery that fall to the lot of these poor mortals who inhabit the open spaces of the earth. They are not our race, it is true, yet compassion well benefits being so fairly favored as ourselves. Often as I pass by the dwelling of some suffering mortal, I am tempted to stop and banish the poor thing's misery. Yet suffering in moderation is the natural lot of mortals, and it's not our place to interfere with the laws of nature." "Nevertheless," said the fair queen, nodding her golden head as the master woodsman, "it would not be a vain guess that Auk has often assisted these helpless mortals." Auk smiled. "Sometimes," he replied, "when they're very young, children the mortals call them, I've stopped to rescue them from misery. The men and women I dare not interfere with. They must bear the burdens nature has imposed upon them. But the helpless infants, the innocent children of men, have a right to be happy, and they become full grown and able to bear the trials of humanity. So I feel I'm justified in assisting them. Not long ago, a year maybe, I found 4 poor children huddled in a wooden hut, slowly freezing to death. Their parents had gone to a neighboring village for food, and had left a fire to warm their little ones while they were absent. But a storm arose and drifted the snow in their path, so they were long on the road. Meantime the fire went out, and the frost crept into the bones of the waiting children." "Poor things," murmured the queen softly. "What did you do?" "I called Nelko, bidding him fetch wood from my forest and breathe upon it until the fire blazed again and warmed the little room where the children lay. Then they ceased shivering and fell asleep until their parents came." "I'm glad you did thus," said the good queen, beaming upon the master, and Necile, who had eagerly listened to every word, echoed in a whisper, "I too am glad." "And this very night," continued Auk, "as I came to the edge of Burzee, I heard a feeble cry, which I judged came from a human infant. I looked about me, and I found, close to the forest, a helpless babe, lying quite naked upon the grasses and wailing pitilessly. Not far away, screened by the forest, crouched Shagira, the lioness, intent upon devouring the infant for her evening meal." "And what did you do, Auk?" asked the queen breathlessly. "Not much, being in a hurry to greet my nymphs, but I commanded Shagira to tie close to the babe and to give it her milk and to quiet its hunger. And I told her to send word throughout the forest to all beasts and reptiles that the child should not be harmed." "I'm glad you did this," said the good queen again, in a tone of relief, but this time Necile did not echo her words, for the nymph, filled with a strange resolve, had suddenly stolen away from the group. Swiftly her lithe form darted through the forest paths until she reached the edge of the mighty Burzee, when she paused to gaze curiously about her. Never until now had she ventured so far, for the law of the forest had placed the nymphs in its inmost depths. Necile knew she was breaking the law, but the thought did not give pause to her dainty feet. She decided to see with her own eyes this infant Auk had told of, for she had never yet beheld a child of man. All the immortals are full grown. There are no children among them. Peering through the trees, Necile saw the child lying on the grass, but now he was sweetly sleeping, having been comforted by the milk drawn from Shagira. It was not old enough to know what peril means. If it did not feel hunger, it was content. Softly the nymph stole to the side of the babe and knelt upon the sward of her long robe of rose-leaf color spreading about her like a gossamer cloud. Her lovely countenance expressed curiosity and surprise, but most of all a tender, womanly pity. The babe was newborn, chubby and pink. It was entirely helpless. While the nymph gazed, the infant opened his eyes, smiled upon her, and stretched out two dimpled arms. In another instant, Necile had caught it to her chest and was hurrying with it throughout the forest path. Chapter 3. The Adoption. The master woodsman suddenly rose with knitted brows. "There's a strange presence in the forest," he declared. Then the queen and her nymphs turned and saw standing before them Necile, with a sleeping infant clasped tightly in her arms and a defiant look in her deep blue eyes. And thus, for a moment, they remained, the nymphs filled with surprise and consternation, but the brow of the master woodsman gradually clearing as he gazed intently upon the beautiful immortal who had wilfully broken the law. Then the great Ock, to the wonder of all, laid his hand softly on Necile's flowing locks and kissed her on her fair forehead. "For the first time within my knowledge," he said gently, "a nymph has defied me and my laws, yet in my heart can I find no word of chiding. What is your desire, Necile?" "Let me keep the child," she answered, beginning to tremble and falling on her knees in supplication. "Here, in the forest of Burzee, where the human race has never yet penetrated?" questioned Ock. "Here, in the forest of Burzee," replied the nymph boldly. "It is my home, and I'm weary for lack of occupation. Let me care for the babe. See how weak and helpless it is. Surely it cannot harm Burzee, nor the master woodsman of the world." "But the law, child, the law," cried Ock sternly. "The law is made by the master woodsman," returned Necile, "and if he bids me care for the babe, he himself is safe from death. Who in all the world dare oppose me?" Queen Zerline, who had listened intently to this conversation, clapped her pretty hands gleefully at the nymph's answer. "You're fairly trapped, O Ock," she exclaimed, laughing. "Now, I pray you give heed to Necile's petition." The woodsman, as was his habit when in thought, stroked his grizzled beard slowly. Then he said, "She shall keep the babe, and I'll give it my protection. But I warn you, all that as this is the first time I have relaxed the law, so shall it be the last time. Never more, to the end of the world, shall a mortal be adopted by an immortal. Otherwise would we abandon our happy existence for one of trouble and anxiety. Good night, my nymph." Then Ock was gone from their midst, and Necile hurried away to her bower to rejoice over her new-found treasure. Chapter 4. Another day found Necile's bower the most popular place in the forest. The nymphs clustered around her and the child that lay asleep in her lap, with expressions of curiosity and delight. Nor were they wanting in praise for the great Ock's kindness in allowing Necile to keep the babe and to care for it. Even the queen came to peer into the innocent childish face and to hold a helpless chubby fist in her own fair hand. "What shall we call him, Necile?" she asked, smiling. "He must have a name, you know." "Let him be called Claus," answered Necile, "for that means a little one." "Rather let him be called Claus," returned the queen, "for that will mean Necile's little one." The nymphs clapped their hands in delight, and Claus became the infant's name, although Necile loved best to call him Claus, and in after days many of her sisters followed her example. Necile gathered the softest moss in all the forest for Claus to lie upon, and she made his bed in her own bower. Of food the infant had no lack. The nymphs searched the forest for bell udders, which grew upon the goa tree, and when opened are found to be filled with sweet milk. And the soft-eyed does willingly gave a share of their milk to support the little stranger, while Shagira, the lioness, often crept stealthily into Necile's bower and purred softly as she lay beside the babe and fed it. So the little one flourished and grew big and sturdy day by day, while Necile taught him to speak and to walk and to play. His thoughts and words were sweet and gentle, for the nymphs knew no evil, and their hearts were pure and loving. He became the pet of the forest, for Ock's decree had forbidden beast or reptile to hurt him, and he walked fearlessly wherever his will guided him. Presently the news reached the other immortals that the nymphs of Burzee had adopted a human infant. and that the act had been sanctioned by the great Ak. Therefore, many of them came to visit the little stranger, looking upon him with much interest. First the Riles, who were first cousins to the wood nymphs, although so differently formed, for the Riles are required to watch over the flowers and the plants, and the nymphs watch over the forest trees. They search the wide world for the feed required by the roots of the flowering plants, while the brilliant colors possessed by the full-blown flowers are due to the dyes placed in the soil by the Riles, which are drawn through the little veins in the roots and the body of the plants as they reach maturity. The Riles are a busy people, for their flowers bloom and fade continually, but they are merry and light-hearted and are very popular with the other immortals. Next came the Nooks, whose duty it is to watch over the beasts of the world, both gentle and wild. The Nooks have a hard time of it, since many of the beasts are ungovernable and rebel against restraint, but they know how to manage them. After all, and you'll find that certain laws of the Nooks are obeyed by even the most ferocious animals, their anxieties make the Nooks look old and worn and crooked, and their natures are a bit rough from associating with wild creatures continually, yet they're not most useful to humanity and to the world in general, as their laws are the only laws in the forest beasts recognize, except those of the Master Woodsman. Then there were the Fairies, the guardians of mankind, who were much interested in the adoption of Claus because of their own law forbade them to become familiar with their human charges. There are instances on record where the fairies have shown themselves such human beings and have even conversed with them, but they're supposed to guard the lives of mankind unseen and unknown, and if they favor some people more than others, it is because these have won such distinction fairly, as the fairies are very just and impartial. But the idea of adopting a child of men had never occurred to them, because it was in every way opposed to their laws. So their curiosity was intense to behold the little stranger, adopted by Necile and her sister nymphs. Claus looked upon the immortals, who thronged around him with fearless eyes and smiling lips. He rode laughingly upon the shoulders of the merry Riles. He mischievously pulled the gray beards of the low-browed Nooks. He rested his curly head confidently upon the dainty bosom of the Fairy Queen herself, and the Riles loved the sound of his laughter, and the Nooks loved his courage, and the Fairies loved his innocence. The boy made friends of them all, and learned to know their laws intimately. No forest flower was trampled beneath his feet, lest the friendly Riles should be grieved. He never interfered with the beasts of the forest, lest his friends the Nooks should become angry. The fairies he loved dearly, but knowing nothing of mankind, he could not understand that he was the only one of his race admitted to friendly discourse with them. Indeed, Claus came to consider that he alone, of all the forest people, had no ilks nor fellow. To him the forest was the world. He had no idea that millions of toiling, striving human creatures existed, and he was happy and content. Chapter 5. Years passed swiftly in Burzee, for the nymphs had no need to regard time in any way. Even centuries make no change in the dainty creatures. Ever and ever they remain the same, immortal and unchanging. Claus, however, being mortal, grew to manhood day by day. Necile was disturbed presently to find him too big to lie in her lap, and he had a desire for other food than milk. His stout legs carried him far into the Burzee's heart, where he gathered supplies of nuts and berries, as well as several sweet and wholesome roots, which suited his stomach better than the bee-letters. He sought Necile's bower less frequently, till finally it became the custom to return hither only to sleep. The nymph who had come to love him dearly was puzzled to comprehend the changed nature of her charge, and unconsciously altered her own mode of life to conform to his whims. She followed him readily through the forest paths, as did many of her sister nymphs, explaining as they walked all the mysteries of the gigantic wood, and the habits and nature of the living things which dwelt beneath its shade. The language of the beasts became clear to little Claus, but he never could understand their sulky and morose tempers. Only the squirrels, the mice, and the rabbits seemed to possess cheerful and merry natures. Yet would the boy laugh when the panther growled, and stroked the bear's glossy coat while the creature snarled and bared its teeth menacingly. The growls and snarls were not for Claus, he well knew. So what did they matter? He could sing the song of the bees, recite the poetry of the woodflowers, and relate the history of every blinking owl in the Burzee. He helped the Rouse to feed their plants and the Nooks to keep order among the animals. The little immortals regarded him as a privileged person, being especially protected by Queen Zerline and her nymphs, and favored by the great Ak himself. One day the master woodman came back to the forest of Burzee. He had visited in turn all of his forests throughout the world, and they were many and broad. Not until he entered the glade where the queen and her nymphs were assembled to greet him did Ak remember the child he had permitted Necile to adopt. Then he found sitting familiarly in the circle of lovely immortals a broad-shouldered, stalwart youth who, when erect, stood fully as high as the shoulder of the master himself. Ak paused, silent and frowning, to bend his piercing gaze upon Claus. The clear eyes met his own steadfastly, and the woodsman gave a sigh of relief as he marked their placid depths and read the youth's brave and innocent heart. Nevertheless, as Ak sat beside the fair queen, and the golden chalice, filled with rare nectar, passed from lip to lip, the master woodsman was strangely silent and reserved, and stroked his beard many times with a thoughtful motion. With morning he called Claus aside in kindly fashion, saying, "Bid, good boy, for a time to Necile and her sisters, for you shall accompany me on my journey through the world." The venture pleased Claus, who knew well the honor of being companion of the master woodsman of the world. But Necile wept for the first time in her life, and clung to the boy's neck as if she could not bear to let him go. The nymph who had mothered this sturdy youth, and still as dainty, as charming and beautiful as when she dared to face Ak with the babe clasped to her breast, nor was her love less great. Ak beheld the two clinging together, seemingly as brother and sister to one another, and again he wore his thoughtful look. Chapter 6. Taking Claus to a small clearing in the forest, the master said, "Place your hand upon my girdle and hold fast while we journey through the air. For now shall we encircle the world and look upon many of the haunts of those men from whom you are descended." These words caused Claus to marvel, for until now he had thought himself the only one of his kind upon the earth. Yet in silence he grasped firmly the girdle of the great Ak, his astonishment forbidding speech. Then the vast forest of Burzee seemed to fall away from their feet, and the youth found himself passing swiftly through the air at a great height. Ere long there were spires beneath them, while buildings of many shapes and colors met their downward view. It was a city of men, and Ak, pausing to descend, led Claus to its enclosure. Said the master, "So long as you hold fast to my girdle, you will remain unseen by all mankind, though seeing clearly yourself. To release your grasp will be to separate yourself forever from me and your home in Burzee." One of the first laws of the forest is obedience, and Claus had no thought of disobeying the master's wish. He clung fast to the girdle and remained invisible. Thereafter, with each moment passed in the city, the youth's wonders grew. He who had supposed himself created differently from all the others now found the earth swarming with creatures of his own kind. "Indeed," said Ak, "the immortals are few, but the mortals are many." Claus looked earnestly upon his fellows. There were sad faces, gay and reckless faces, pleasant faces, anxious faces, and kindly faces, all mingled in puzzling disorder. Some worked at tedious tasks, some strutted in imprudent conceit, some were thoughtful and grave, while others seemed happy and content. Many of natures were there, as everywhere, and Claus found much to please him, and much to make him sad. But especially he noted the children, first curiously, then eagerly, then lovingly. Ragged little ones rolled in the dust of the streets, playing with scraps and pebbles. Other children, gaily dressed, were propped upon cushions and fed with sugar plums. Yet the children of the rich were not happier than those playing with the dust and the pebbles, it seemed to Claus. "Childhood is the time of man's greatest content," said Ak, following the youth's thoughts. "'Tis during these years of innocent pleasure that the little ones are most free from care." "Tell me," said Claus, "why do not all these babies fare alike?" Because they are born in both cottage and palace, returned the master. The difference in the wealth of the parents determines a lot of the child. Some are carefully tended and clothed in silk and dainty linen. Others are neglected and covered with rags. Yet all seem equally fair and sweet, said Claus thoughtfully. While they are babes, yes, agreed Ark. Their joy is in being alive, and they do not stop to think. In after years, the doom of mankind overtakes them, and they find they must struggle and worry, work and fret, to gain the wealth that is so dear to the hearts of men. Such things are unknown in the forest where you are reared. Claus was silent a moment, and then he asked, Why, I was reared in the forest, among those who are not of my race. Then Ak, in gentle voice, told him the story of his babyhood, how he had been abandoned at the forest edge and left a prey to wild beasts, and how the loving nymph Necile had rescued him and brought him to manhood under the protection of the immortals. Yet I am not of them, said Claus musingly. You are not of them, returned the woodsman. The nymph who cared for you as a mother seemed now like a sister to you. By and by, when you grow old and gray, she will seem like a daughter. Yet another brief span and you will be but a memory, while she remains Necile. Then why, if man must perish, is he born? Demanded the boy. Everything perishes except the world itself and its keepers, answered Ak. But while life lasts, everything on earth has its use. The wise seek ways to be helpful to the world, for the helpful ones are sure to live again. Much of this Claus failed to understand fully, but a longing seized him to become helpful to his fellows, and he remained grave and thoughtful while they resumed their journey. They visited many dwellings of men in many parts of the world, watching farmers toil in the fields, warriors dash into cruel fray, and merchants exchange their goods for bits of white and yellow metal. And everywhere the eyes of Claus sought out the children in love and pity, for the thought of his own helpless babyhood was strong within him, and he yearned to give help to the innocent little ones of his race, even as he had been succored by the kindly nymph. Day by day the master woodsman and his pupil traversed the earth, Ak speaking, but seldom to the youth who clung steadfastly to his girdle, but guiding him into all the places where he might become familiar with the lives of human beings. And at last they returned to the grand old forest of Verzi, where the master sat Claus down within the circle of nymphs, among whom the pretty Necile anxiously awaited him. The brow of the great Ak was now calm and peaceful, but the brow of Claus had become lined with deep thought. Necile sighed at the change in her foster son, who until now had been ever joyous and smiling, and the thought came to her that never again would the life of the boy be the same as before this eventful journey with the master. Chapter 7. When good Queen Zerline had touched the golden chalice with her fair lips and had passed around the circle in honor of the traveler's return, the master woodsman of the world, who had not yet spoken, turned his gaze frankly upon Claus and said, Well? The boy understood, and rose slowly to his feet beside Necile. Once only his eyes passed around the familiar circle of nymphs, every one of whom he remembered as a loving comrade, but tears came unbidden to dim his sight, so he gazed thereafter steadfastly at the master. I have been ignorant, said he simply, until the great Ak in his kindness taught me who and what I am. You, who live so sweetly in your forest bowers, ever fair and youthful and innocent, are no fit comrades for a son of humanity, for I have looked upon man, finding him doomed to live for a brief space upon the earth, to toil for the things he needs, to fade into old age, and then to pass away as the leaves in autumn. Yet every man has his mission, which is to leave the world better in some way than he found it. I am of the race of men, and man's lot is my lot. For your tender care of the poor, forsaken babe you adopted, as well as for your loving comradeship during my boyhood, my heart will ever overflow with gratitude. My foster mother, here he stopped and kissed Necile's white forehead. I shall love and cherish while life lasts, but I must leave you to take my part in the endless struggle to which humanity is doomed, and to live my life in my own way. What will you do? Asked the queen gravely. I must devote myself to the care of the children of mankind, and try to make them happy, he answered. Since your own tender care of a babe brought me to happiness and strength, it is just and right that I devote my life to the pleasure of other babes. Thus will the memory of the loving nymph Necile be planted within the hearts of thousands of my race for many years to come, and her kindly act be recounted in song and in story while the world shall last. Have I spoken well, O master?" "You have spoken well," returned Ock, and rising to his feet he continued, "Yet one thing must not be forgotten. Having been adopted as the child of the forest and the playfellow of the nymphs, you have gained a distinction which forever separates you from your kind. Therefore, when you go forth into the world of men, you shall retain the protection of the forest, and the powers you now enjoy will remain with you to assist you in your labors. In any need you may call upon the nymphs, the Ryls, the Nooks, and the Fairies, and they will serve you gladly. I, the master woodsman of the world, have said it, and my word is the law." Claus looked upon Ock with grateful eyes. "This will make me mighty among men," he replied. "Protected by these kind friends, I may be able to make thousands of little children happy. I will try very hard to do my duty, and I know the forest people will give me their sympathy and help." "We will," said the Fairy Queen earnestly. "We will," cried the merry Ryls, laughing. "We will," shouted the crooked Nooks, scowling. "We will," exclaimed the sweet nymphs proudly. But Necile said nothing. She only folded Claus into her arms and kissed him tenderly. "The world is big," continued the boy, turning again to his loyal friends, "but men are everywhere. I shall begin my work near my friends, so that if I meet with misfortune, I can come to the forest for counsel or help." With that, he gave them all a loving look and turned away. There was no need to say goodbye. For him, the sweet wild life of the forest was over. He went forth bravely to meet his doom, the doom of the race of men, the necessity to worry and work. But Ock, who knew the boy's heart, was merciful and guided his steps. Coming through Burzee to its eastern edge, Claus reached the laughing valley of Ho, Ho, Ho. On each side were rolling green hills, and a brook wandered midway between them to wind afar off beyond the valley. At his back was the grim forest, at the far end of the valley as a broad plain. The eyes of the young man, which had until now reflected his grave thoughts, became brighter as he stood silent, looking out upon the laughing valley. Then, on a sudden, his eyes twinkled as stars do on a still night, and grew merry and wide. For at his feet the cowslips and daisies smiled on him in friendly regard. The breeze whistled gaily as it passed by and fluttered the locks on his forehead. The brook laughed joyously as it leapt over the pebbles and swept around the green curves of its banks. The bees sang sweet songs as they flew from dandelion to daffodil. The beetles chirped happily in the long grass, and the sunbeams glinted pleasantly over all of the scene. "Here," cried Claus, stretching out his arms as if to embrace the valley, "will I make my home." That was many, many years ago. It has now been his home ever since, and it is his home now. That's the end of the youth part of his story. We'll read the second part on the next video. You've reached the end of the video, and I know my buddy Mac is still listening, and I'll record the second half of the story tomorrow. So, like, share, subscribe. If you guys have any suggestions of videos that you would like to see or stories that you want to hear, leave them in the comments down below. Until next time, bye.